Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the BVM Super Bandit build series. This is video number 6 in the build series and we are focusing on the vertical stab or the rudder. Last video we did the elevators, horizontal stabs, which are right there. They're curing, which is why they're sitting there. This episode is going to start off, maybe the entire episode is going to be focused on the rudder. So let's dive in to this surface. All right, so we got to jump back a little bit in the manual because we didn't finish up our mounting on the front of the vertical stab. So we did get our mounting system all figured out, but we still have to deal with our actual screw and mount and everything. So first thing we have to do is we got to cut this off. We want to just cut it sort of to flush with the leading edge of the vertical stab. We're going to sand this out later, but let's get that cut off as a first step. So we're probably just going to use as a pull saw here through the aluminum, and that should be fine. Okay, so that was fairly straightforward, easy to cut through that aluminum tube with the pull saw, and then we just use some sandpaper to finish it off, and it looks good. So we're going to pull the bolt out now, get the rudder installed on the aircraft. Now, one thing we have to do first is we actually got to take off the rudder surface itself, so we're going to have to cut this off. We have to do that because right now the rudder's not sitting down all the way because of the tail fixing tab here. So for this, we'll do it just like we did with the elevators. Probably use a straight edge, a nice strong X-Acto blade, and just make a nice cut there. And then we may finish it off with our pull saw. Now we're going to install the vertical stab, pull the bolt out, get the front lined up. All right, so nothing overly exciting here, but we got our little plate with our blind nut and everything installed. That's all nice and centered now. And we did go in afterwards and I used a gloved finger and I put a couple fillets of high sol on each side of the wood piece that's holding the blind nut. So rudder is very, very well secured. So with that, we can now move on to the hinging of the rudder. So there are two rudders that are available with the Super Bandit. There's the swept fin and also the straight one. We are doing the swept fin in this manual, and we're also doing the swept fin on the model, which is the more popular one. Okay, so we're gonna just go through all of our steps here. First thing we have to do is trim a 1/16 off the top of the rudder. So that is 1/16 off of this side here, not the bottom side, just to allow space for the tab on the bottom. All right, so we're just working through the steps here. We trimmed 1/16 off the top of the rudder surface. That's done. Trimmed the leading edge, fin tip, and root of excess flashing. Now it does say trim the trailing edge after hinging is complete. So I'm assuming we do not trim this portion and do not trim this portion, as those are the trailing edges. So we have trimmed the whole front of the vertical stab surface, and we have done the root previously. All right, so we're supposed to block sand the fin trailing edge just enough to establish a straight hinge line. So that is important. So we'll use our there we go, nothing too crazy. I think this is just a matter of smoothing it out is the reason, so that's done. I'm also going to sand this area up here where we cut because it's not super smooth. Now one thing we'll do when we're especially in those elevators that we completed in the last video, is we'll go back, because we made a groove in the elevator here, we'll go back and we'll wick some thin CA into the balsa that's in these surfaces. So not worrying about that now because we need to be able to sand these things down, but that's a good thing to do because these surfaces here also get fairly thin when you're sanding this area down. Okay, so we need to block sand the rudder leading edge to remove 1/16 of material. So what I'll do in this case is I'm going to take my straight edge, mark out 1/16 on both sides. So we've got a nice even line to go on, but we have to get rid of, just like we did on the elevators, we have to get rid of some material here. And then I think what happens is this gets glued on to the elevator surface, and then we mold a nice profile on the front of it. Okay, so we've taken a 1/16 off the leading edge of the actual rudder surface here. Next thing to do is mark out our hinges. Now the rudder has a bit of a different hinge system, so I think you're using more hinges on the bottom portion or a double hinge or something like that. So let's go take a look at the plans. Okay, so when we look at the plans here, yes, we've got a double hinge on the bottom and then just a standard, I guess, 2-piece hinge. The double hinge obviously prevents this from sliding or moving. So what we're going to do now is we're going to mark out our hinge locations on the rudder surface. All right, so we've jumped ahead here quite a bit. We've got our holes cut, our hinges installed, our gluing holes completed. Now I was thinking about not doing these gluing holes and just kind of working around this, but I found that with the BVM stuff so far, if you try and deviate from the instructions, it doesn't really work that good. There's a reason there's instructions, so just follow them. And the point of that was to try and get rid of the gluing holes, but not a big deal. They sand out nicely, they fill nicely. You'll never see them when it's painted, obviously. So now these have been tack glued in place, which is what the instructions call for. So we're just continuing on with the instructions here. So next thing is to aero epoxy the hinges in place. Okay, so there's a couple small details here that are quite important. I'll try and capture this for you guys. So if you look at the edges here, you can see that little sliver of carbon, which is kind of the dark area. And we've got one on this side. Now on the interior side of that carbon, you've got a little bit of high sol or aero epoxy that was used when they put this together. And on the side that my hand's on, that band of aero epoxy is wider. So what I did was took my Dremel, sanded this one down, because what's going to happen here is as you're making the concave, you're going to naturally get pushed over more to that side because you're just sanding down the balsa. So if you've got more high sol on this side, it's naturally going to push your thing over, your sanding device over, and you're going to get a misshapen rudder. So important to pay attention to details like that so your sanding ends up being equal. All right, what is this crazy contraption? Well, this is our way of holding everything nice and centered. So we're using popsicle sticks as our spacer away from the vertical stab. So we've got that spaced out. So when we use those popsicle sticks, you can see right there, hopefully that shows up. So you can see right there, everything comes into alignment with our tail here. So that's what we're looking at right there. So that's the spacing that we're going to use. If we need to adjust that at all a little bit to get our required travel, we can adjust the opening a little bit. We've got the popsicle sticks on the side. That's holding the entire rudder side to side. So when we take a look this direction here, it's lined up on both sides perfectly. So with all this lined up, what we're going to do is we are going to put some CA on our hinges just to spot glue those in place. All right, so we've got our pieces of the balsa that came with the kit glued onto the leading edge of the rudder. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our razor plane and we're going to shape this. This is where the handwork, old-fashioned tool work kind of comes in. I'll show you the tool that we're using in case you don't know what it is. So this is the master air screw razor plane thing. Yeah, that's basically it. All right, so if you've never seen the razor plane, this is the razor plane in action. It works really well. It's just a good tool if you're using it with balsa. Cuts through it very nicely. So anyways, we'll continue shaping this leading edge of the rudder with this. All right, and rudder is done as far as the surface goes. We still have a bunch of work to do on the rudder, but we are getting the required amount of deflection now with the rudder, which is awesome. Everything's nicely fit. We've got our hinge pin in there, so everything's been shaped on the leading edge, which is wonderful. So next thing it says to do in the manual is to get rid of our excess little flashing piece here, which is what we'll do. We'll just use a sanding block for that. The other thing that's a little bit weird is they want you to do a little bit of a cutout here on the leading edge of the rudder surface. And the reason for that is when you actually move the surface, just because the angles it would contact the fin here. So what I did is I just kept this nice and straight, just so you don't have a weird little bevel thing and then a straight line. I think this looks better, so that's the way we decided to go on that. So we'll sand this down and take a look at the next step. All right, so we've got our rudder all essentially complete. We're all sanded and nice and flush all along our back edge. Next thing in the manual is moving on to the servo mount. So we will go back on the rudder and also the elevators at a little bit of a later stage here, and we'll deal with the balsa that's exposed and treat that with CA. So we'll go back to that eventually. But for right now, we're going to move on to the rudder mount and the control arms coming out of the actual vertical stab. So we're going to get into gathering all the parts up and going through each of our steps. Okay, so first thing we have to do is glue a piece of 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch balsa. Hard to show you because it's kind of buried underneath there. Now the manual is not very good here at all. The picture is terrible. So let's take a look at the plans and I'll show you what we're actually talking about. So the very first step is cutting this 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch piece of balsa. That gets glued across the vertical stab, and it simply just gets butted up to the tube here, the fixing tube. So that's been done. Next step is to glue the 1/32 ply formers into the sides of the vertical stab. So we'll do that next, and then we move on, I think, to gluing those blocks in place as well. All right, so we've got our blocks installed in the vertical stab. Just took a little bit of time to sand it. You can see our arrow marks there. That was to help keep our direction and everything, because you have to sand down angles and to make it fit perfect. So we have CA'd them in place, just spot glued them in place, and now we mixed up some Hysol and we're going to get them glued in place and let that stuff cure. Now we are installing a 9930 servo in the rudder, so I did make sure that this servo fits, and we're going to use this to get everything lined up as well in the vertical stab. Okay, so we got our rudder linkage here, which is the threaded rod. We went a little bit big on the hole size, and the reason for that is so we could get some aero epoxy in there. So that's been added to that as well. It's curing. So now we've got this location plus our rudder servo arm location, and now we can draw a straight line between these two, and that's going to be the angle of our linkage system that's going to go through. All right, guys, we're going to set the vertical stab aside. We need to let some of the Hysol cure before we can do anything else. So we have glued in our brass tubes here. You can see that they are essentially flush with the surface of the vertical stab. So we haven't come proud with the Hysol because we're going to fill that up with fiberglass putty. And we did the same thing on this side over here. So you look from the inside, we've got Hysol throughout holding those brass tubes in, and that is perfect. So we've got a couple more steps to do on the vertical stab, but we'll get back to that when we are able to finish up those little pockets. Now it's the next day and all of our epoxy is cured, which is great. So we pulled the tape off last night here. You can see where the epoxy was kind of squished down with the tape, and that worked out good. So what we can do now is we can get our hinge system set up on the servo, or at least our arm set up and kind of constructed. But the arm and pull system, we're going to set that aside, and that's going to stay here at the shop. It's not going to go in for paint because we won't be able to finish that side over here until the plane comes back, but at least we can get that sort of set up. One of the reasons to get it set up is so we can get our material here finished. So the next thing we're going to do on this vertical stab is we are going to fill in these areas with putty, and that'll allow us to sand this down and get this area finished. All right, so we mixed up some more polyester glazing putty, and what I did was I filled these areas in with the putty. This is still all wet right now, and then fed our wires through to make a nice channel. So once this kind of kicks off, what I'll do is I will just make sure the wire's loose, or I'll pull it out all the way. But this is going to be a nice clean finish when it's done. All right, so we've sanded this side down here. I just put the wire in, and that is what we are looking at and looking for. So it is almost invisible now at this point. That's perfect. So all you'll see if the linkages aren't in here and this is painted is you'll see that tiny little slot. And then of course our linkage is right there. Super cool, that's perfect. All right, so for the last part of this video, we're gonna wrap up the little details on these surfaces. So we're gonna do the vertical stab, but also the horizontal stabs. I'm just gonna show you guys the final touches here on what we're gonna do. All right, so first thing with the elevators here, we're not gonna do the normal stock setup. So the stock setup says that you have this wire come out at some point, bend this way, and you put a screw in there. We're not doing that. We will put tip guards made of carbon fiber on the tips here. But what we're going to do is we're just going to keep this rod as this piece right here. And we are going to leave it be. And this will get painted or whatever. And then we are just going to snip that wire off. We can put a little bit of goop or CA on the tip of that wire to hold it in place. But that's essentially how we're going to leave it, just like that. Now there is a stop built into the elevator surface, so this only goes in so far, and then it hits the end of the nye rod that we glued in there. Rudder, a little bit of a different story. So what we're gonna do is make a little channel down here, and we've got just a little nub of this wire sticking down. Now that wire does go into the balsa work up here. So when we take these surfaces off, I'll show you exactly how we're treating all that stuff. But we've got just a little nub there that we are going to bend over, and that's going to follow the underside of the rudder here, and that's going to go inside of a little notch. So let's do that part first, and then we will look at all the surface and balsa treatment. Okay, so we're just going to take our, I forget what these things are called. Somebody told me linear pliers or something like that. Anyways, we're going to take these guys. We've got our little area marked out, and pop this out, and then just bend this wire. So we've got the little bend on the piano wire there. We'll kind of give our rough guess on the angle. Not quite enough, so we'll bend it some more. And that looks like that should work. And if you look here at the tip of the rudder surface, you can see how far that nye rod is going into the balsa, or steel rod, I should say, not nye rod. Okay, so what we're gonna do is take our Dremel now, and we're gonna make a little channel here. It doesn't have to be very long, it just has to house this little tip there. All right, guys, and there is the rudder holding pin. So that is perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. Nice and flush now when you look at a side profile, and basically disappears. Then of course goes a substantial amount into the vertical stab as well. So now we're going to deal with all of our exposed balsa. So all we do for this is we just take thin CA, and we're just going to soak the wood with thin CA. So areas like the vertical stab here, we've got all this balsa work. We're mainly focusing it on the edges here, where it's not super thin, but it is fairly thin. And then we'll also make sure we get our hole here and all of this type of area. And the other thing that this does is it makes sure that the little skin, or the fiberglass skin, doesn't delaminate from the balsa as easy. So we've got a couple little chips and stuff. That's kind of what it prevents. It just hardens up those edges. So, all right, and there's an example of it all treated with CA. Now I'm not going to spray kicker on this. I'm just going to let it soak in naturally by itself and kick off by itself. So it's as flat and smooth as possible. And I just, when I did this, I essentially just did the edges. There was enough excess that flowed into the center, and wiped off the excess with a cloth. And now it is good to go. So you want to make sure you do this after you're 100% happy with everything, because this is going to make the balsa very difficult to sand if you do it beforehand. So now we'll do our other surfaces there, the elevators. All right, so we're just working on getting the elevators mounted to the fuselage here, and also the rudder as well too. So I just want to wrap these things up before we move on to the wings. We've got everything treated with CA like we talked about on all the different surfaces. So now we've plugged in the elevators, had to make a little notch right there. I'm still at quite a loss of how this whole thing assembles because there's really not a good way to get this into the tail cone piece and get the fuselage, get the surface lined up with the fuselage. I'm at quite a loss with this. So anyways, the rudder itself, quite straightforward on the mounting. The only thing left for us to do is, if you look at the shaft there, you'll see the screw mark. So we want to put a little indent in that area, and that is going to line up with our set screw right here. All right, guys, and just taking a look at the tail cone piece here. Now, a couple episodes ago, when we were working on the tail section of this plane, I talked about how we were fitting this whole piece to the fuselage. So the top was fitting nicely. We got the midpoint here fitting good with our little pins, and the bottom was way out. So we added our relief cuts and got that clamped in place and then filled it with high sol. So this is what it looks like when it was filled. Worked out really well. So we're gonna sand these down a little bit to get rid of them, but this is exactly what we wanted to happen. So now the whole tail cone piece here is nice and rigid because all of our joints are full of high sol. All right, and tail is together for the first time. This is not a lot of fun, but we did manage to get it together. So I kind of squeezed this left side and the tail cone on at the same time. That was a challenge, and then I was trying to figure out how to get this side on. I had to basically deflect the surface the full direction, kind of get it started like this, and then drop the leading edge down and get the carbon rod in. So the metal rod back here is a little bit longer than the carbon rod, so you kind of engage the metal rod at a really steep angle like this, and then get it in. It's definitely a struggle, but I guess it does work, and it's very accurate. So we have the tail together for the first time. Yes, we're missing the vertical stab, but it's there. All right, guys, and that brings the tail together for the very first time on this aircraft. Very happy to see this. The tail is definitely a struggle. It is a tight section. I'm happy that this tail really isn't going to be taken apart. That's one of the nice things about the smaller size aircraft is once this is together, unless you have something to service, you can pretty much leave the thing together. I would not be wanting to take this apart. It is a struggle for sure. We talk about this often in the videos. We talked about it last night on the live at the Lighter Side of RC After Dark. If you're not familiar with the Lighter Side of RC After Dark, definitely suggest you check it out. We talked about some of the stuff that we've covered in this video today, but it was weeks ago before this video came out. So anyways, up to this point now in the build, we are at, I think the number last night was 87 hours to get to this point. So we are starting the wings next. That is going to be a gigantic accomplishment or hurdle to accomplish getting over. The wings are a lot of work. We still have a lot of work on this plane. We do have a deadline, 2 weeks. We need to have this thing ready for paint, which we will get done. So anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching the videos. Thanks for supporting the channel. If you have any questions or comments, list them down below. One other thing I'll finish with too is people reach out to me quite often saying, hey, I'd like to buy a hat from you or a sweater or whatever. The links down below while you're watching YouTube, there's like merchandise right down below in pictures. That is put up there by me. So I don't stock any of it. It's all supplied by 2 different websites, depending on what you click on. They manufacture it and ship it to you. So if you want to support the channel, if you want some merchandise, it's right down there below. So thanks guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.